Appamada and its programs are supported by your generosity, and your generosity and support makes such a difference. You can find a link for contributions on the website at appamada.org. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. It's lovely to be with you. My wife and I spent the day yesterday planting flowers, which was a lovely thing to be able to do, and chasing a toddler all around the yard who was promptly trying to pull up all the flowers we were planting. So it's good to be with you. So I thought I'd share a few reflections this morning around the theme of silent illumination that we've been practicing with over the practice period. And as last time when I gave a Dharma talk, I'll probably pause along the way and just ask for some reflection. So just prepare for that. And for folks online, Nancy has a couple of quotes ready for us so that you'll be able to see if you can't hear me quite as well. So for as long as I can remember, I've loved words. And I've loved them as a painter loves paint or a sculptor likes clay. I love their ability to describe, experience, exude care, and create possibility. I love the way words wielded well can arrest the mind and stop the breath, or even shape the world. But lately, I'm wary of words, and I'm a little wary of using them today for fear that they may muddy the proverbial waters of our practice. In Council 3, we're reading Barbara O'Brien's Circle of the Way, and she too acknowledges the trickiness of words in our practice. What is realized and called enlightenment, or in Asian languages, awakening, is a reality so far removed from the way we normally perceive reality that explaining it simply doesn't work. Language itself developed to describe conventional reality by slicing it into verbs and nouns, subjects and objects. How does one explain that which is unsliced? Nothing we can say is going to be exactly right. Those last two lines in particular are still working through me, the idea that we're working through or we're meeting that which is unsliced. So it gives me a little bit of comfort to know that nothing I say will be exactly right. And it also gives me ease to know that our most revered teachers have often explored that which is unsliced with messy and perfect words just the same. So I'd like to start today with a question using some imperfect words. That being, what is your most prized possession? What is your most prized possession? Take a moment to consider the question. And you might notice the answer that arises first, or maybe the stories that come up right after, or how you change your answer, but just curious. So what is your most prized possession?
First thing that came up for me was this little heavy, tiny little metal Buddha that I got when I was with my dad when I was a little girl at a flea market. And it's been with me. It's one of the things that I've had the longest. It lives in my kitchen windowsill.
Folks online, you can raise your hand to let Nancy know if you want to chime in to what's your most prized possession.
Okay, you won't be astonished, but just now it's my computer because I can be in connection with all of you. It's not what I thought at the beginning because I would take something that I have for a long time and so on. But my computer is my connection with you. So you see.
Thank you.
It's hard to think. The word possession is a weak one, but my four-legged furry son, I possess him in a way that if I didn't, he wouldn't be able to feed himself. And yet I don't own him, but without him, I would be bereft.
I also found myself contemplating the word possession and wondering what the question is really asking. Because I of course, because that's what we're talking about is words, right? And what they can say and what they manage to say and what they don't manage to say. And most precious to me in my life are my furry friends who live with me, but I don't consider them possessions, they're beings. And so that's where they are in my heart, but they're not possessions. Unless we take a very broad view. Is my body my possession? You know, is my ability to connect? So, but in terms of an absolute possession, I just bought a little tiny home and I never ever thought I would be able to do that. And the furniture hasn't really moved in yet, mostly. So I just have this wonderfully empty, beautiful room with trees in all the windows that I sit in when I'm with all of you. And I have just tremendous gratitude that I am fortunate enough to have a little beautiful home. And I feel so grateful that I am tending it very carefully.
Yeah.
Like Genevieve, I think my most prized possession right now is my home. And like everyone that's spoken, I've thought about what I mean when I say possess. But I do think it's my home. It makes me safe. It makes me happy.
Nelda and Becky will finish with you. I think that's you. Your tiny boxes up there.
Thank you, Jeanette, for the segue, because as I went through, ticked off the list of my possessions, the only thing I actually possess, in my opinion, is my body and all that comes with that, my mind, and the thoughts. I get to create them. I'm like a supersonic spaceship computer, you know. I get to travel through time and space. I get to feel, I get to see. I mean, maybe the activity, the practice of packing provisions for the homeless yesterday made me stop and think about, what if everything I had fell away? No home, nothing permanent that is mine, no security, no even ability to pay a bill because I don't have a bill to pay, you know, all those things that are part of our everyday lives. The one thing I get to carry for the rest of my life as mine is my body.
Becky, you have the last word.
What came for me immediately when you asked the question was my life. And then, of course, I went, well, do I possess my life? Does my life possess me? You know, it's like all those things that happen around possession. And then I sort of thought of other possessions and thought, do I possess anything? And so I just ended up with a lot of questions. And I think that questions are the most exciting things we encounter. So thank you.
Thank you all for sharing. So when I was thinking about this, my answer was my mind. I like my mind, my brain, my intellect. I like its capacity for reason, for creativity, for problem solving, even a little problem making. But what's interesting is the thought of having an impaired or diminished mind in any way really gets at me. And so it creates a sort of wave of unpleasantness. But what's more interesting is what's sort of through and around that unpleasantness. And what I really start to wonder is who and really what is it that imagines it owns this thing called the mind? What is it that really worries about this mind's possible and even probable decay? These days, my sense of the constant and consistent I that I once imagined being at the helm for over 43 years, plus debate, is less clear. When I name my mind as a prized possession, what is clear is that wanting is present. Wanting that shows up in the contractions in my lower back, the little quickening of the pulse, the tightening of the throat and hard swallows that follow. The experience of craving is present in the way that this body-mind makes it present in all its conditioned particularity. Who exactly is doing this wanting is less clear, and perhaps that's because upon repeated inspection, our common sense understanding of a self that wants is actually backward. The self doesn't want, wanting creates the self. And so Gogu describes this plainly in Silent Illumination. And Nancy, this is the first quote you might want to pop up. This sense of I is a byproduct of the natural functioning of the brain's neurological wiring, which generates a sense of self that helps us navigate the world. This subjectivity, this sense of a separate self, is not where the problem lies. Subjectivity is the natural function of the brain. The problem lies with our deep-seated attachment to this me, I, and mind, and the discursive thinking that reifies it into a thing. So it's our attachment to this mental construction that leads us astray from our true nature. Zen teaches us that this nature is intrinsically free from these fragmented, random mental activities that come and go, rise and perish. That's their nature. They liberate themselves instant by instant as they come and go. So I'm just curious if anything in that bit from Gogu moves something in you.
I think for me, he describes, when he's describing the creation of the self, and then he talks about our and your, it's cognitive dissonance there. I'm wishing there was another way to communicate that.
Yeah, words don't seem to work quite so well. Bridget.
Well, the phrase is no longer up there, but it was the one that resonated with me was the idea of the deep attachment to me. And so that's what trying to keep a perspective that allows for a more broad view of myself in relationship to the world, I guess, is what was piqued by that quote, but it's no longer visible, so I can't give you the rest of the part.
You got it. That's great. Rosemary.
Hi. Yeah, I just find this so positive because if you really think deeply about this idea of whatever we're experiencing, who we think we are, etc., is really very fleeting, then whatever happens, it just feels very positive to me because when difficult things happen, if you really believe, well, that's not going to last, that's coming and going just like the good things. So it feels, the more I really, I don't say buy in or just really get into this idea, it feels more and more positive to me. So I just wanted to offer that. Thank you.
In my last Dharma talk, I started as a question. I said, what if there are no things? That was sort of the inquiry. And if we take the insight that there are no things seriously, then a particular and peculiar possibility emerges around ownership or possession, namely that it is a fiction. In fact, our everyday notion of self is a fiction, or more accurately, as Gogu says, it's a convention. There's a systems theorist, Norbert Wiener, who says that we are not the stuff that abides, we are patterns that perpetuate themselves. We are whirlpools in a river of ever-flowing water. If you take that really seriously, we're a conscious whirlpool interacting with an infinite array of whirling processes. We can't really be said to possess anything. In fact, the very idea of possession is predicated on a fallacy of thingness, upon which we then fabricate whole fantasies of in here and out there, of mine and yours, of subjects and objects, of ownership and possession. And then we erect economic systems that buttress this fallacy, and we design, we shape political realities anchored in attachment to individuality, and on and on and on. But the premise is off. Can a co-arising human process really claim to own other processes? This seems to me to be the very self-centered dream about which we chant each Sunday during service and on Tuesday after inquiry. Gogu's teaching here is again useful in showing how our familiar but flawed constructs are backwards. And Nancy, this is the second quote. So thoughts, feelings, and narratives are what we grasp internally. Form is what we grasp externally. And this can include our bodies, objects, environment, status, wealth, and appearances. None of these objects of grasping are in and of themselves bad. Sometimes they're needed to help us navigate through life and improve our circumstances. However, when our grasping is driven by possessiveness and obsession, it brings about suffering for ourselves and others. Non-abiding is just a Zen way of saying non-grasping. Everything is fluid, changing, open to opportunities. This is how things, including ourselves, are. Nothing is fixed, rigid. How can anything be grasped? So what resonates with you here?
I think of how familiar it is to want things to stay as they are. Let's say, especially in times of comfort, the desire to keep things as they are because we like it that way. And that view, I think, is very human and just common. But if things didn't change, if in fact the opposite was not true, that the leaves couldn't move or that the rivers couldn't flow, that time wouldn't pass, we'd be stuck. We'd be cement blocks, basically. Life couldn't happen. But it's odd to me that it's so hard to see all of that freedom and movement as positive, because when we experience freedom and movement in directions we don't want, it seems terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Yet it's the source of all of life. So how could life itself be terrifying is kind of an odd thing to me.
Well, actually, my mind, after I spoke, went really exactly to that first quote you read about, my mind was thinking, wait a minute, everything is borrowed. I don't know that I believe in the concept of ownership. It's an idea. And it's like money. We treat money as something important and valuable because we have agreed to do that. not because it is. And I think it's a problematic part of our culture, this idea that our identities are wrapped up in what we own. And the very nature of saying mine is to exclude everyone else. And there are other cultures, and there have been other cultures that haven't embodied their lives or perceive the universe in that way. You know, that, I'm thinking of some Native American tribes. Also, I lived I was married to a man from India for 6 years, and his family often lived with us, and we would go to India. And it was very interesting to me, because I had very severe dietary limitations at the time. So if we were going to go on a hike, for example, I would get something for me that I could eat, but that was not acceptable. It was not acceptable for anyone to have something that wasn't everybody's to share. So it was a very interesting exercise for me in learning that this is all made up. You know, these are rules that we make up. You said a convention. I think that's right. And there are people who are driven to, I'm not exactly sure what they're driven to, but it behooves them to convince us that we need a certain kind of car in order to have a certain kind of identity, in order to have a certain kind of relationship with others, that kind of thing. And I think it's really worth taking time to contemplate this from time to time and remember that we don't have to buy into the constructs that are pervade. And that I really do believe that the less sense of ownership you have, the less suffering you will experience.
Jenna, something you said reminded me that my son is 3, and one of his favorite phrases right now is only I can do it. And in that moment, the whole world gets really small for him, and it's all about whatever it is that he is after. And I've started to watch that. That's a teaching to me now, and go, oh, I do that often. Only I. But that idea that you were describing as you're talking of sort of, how that changes your perspective. Ellen, I see you up there too.
Say, am I unmuted? Yeah. Yeah, I totally relate to what your son had to say. Yeah, and the quote is so appropriate for me. I mean, it's exactly what I'm going through right now. I've become so attached. My views are so fixed, and I'm so certain that I'm right and that I see everything correctly. And what I see is not pleasant. It's not how I would like it. And oh gosh, practice is so useful. I mean, all of a sudden, I just woke up due to various groups I go to here at Appamata and this and that. And I guess primarily we, in the Wednesday afternoon group, we've been on the Lojong slogan, rest and openness of mind. And I just all of a sudden snapped, I am not resting in openness of mind. I am anything but resting in this very fixed, concrete mind, and boy, it helps so much. And so now my practice is just sort of a constant watching. Am I resting in the openness of mind, or am I making everything fixed? And I've decided how everything should be. I can't do that. I don't really know, And so, I mean, I totally relate to the quote, and thank you for it.
And I was in a practice conversation with Peg, and she said, fixed view doesn't mean wrong view, which really struck me. She meaning it might be the correct course of action to take in a particular moment, but your attachment to it, that's the problem that arises in it. That's the fixedness. It was interesting.
Doesn't mean that there's nothing to do.
Right.
But if you hold an openness of mind, it's much clearer, you know, what the next step is.
Yeah, and some of that openness seems to come from recognizing that things are constantly changing and in flux and perpetual flow. So we use the term dependent origination or codependent arising. The polycanon, the term is katika samuppada. Little bit of background on that exact term. The term comes come, pod, up, boots, together, sam, while going, e, back, pati. So we're depending on one another to come together while going back. Fascinating sort of linguistic origin. So from our Buddhist view, there's no permanent there. Existence is empty of inherent substance. It's phenomenal, fleeting, and relational by nature, and human existence is not exempted from this view. It too is a flow of causes and conditions that move through one's embodied, cognitive, and emotional experience. As we practice, we come to see how the common view of static, lasting, and permanent things or energies leads to misunderstanding. And in particular, it leads to possessiveness. The notion of impermanence, anicca, informs Buddhist practice. Bhikkhu Bodhi describes impermanence as comprising the totality of conditioned existence, ranging in scale from the cosmic to the microscopic. Through sustained mindful attention, we can observe a universe of immense dimensions, evolving and disintegrating from the large cosmic empirical view and from this much smaller personal and experiential view. We see, in fact, as Bhikkhu Bodhi says, the fact that all the constituents of our being, bodily and mental, are in constant process, arising and passing away in rapid succession. In our practice, clearly seeing this process nature of reality and abiding within that rising and passing is what allows us to begin to relinquish our habits of possession. In truth, once I sort of acknowledge this and feel this, how off base my way of seeing the world really is, my commonplace way of seeing it, I sometimes get a little unnerved or unsettled, which of course resurrects the very small self that's just seen its own nature and strongly disagrees. But lately I've been practicing with a question that creates a little clarity in those moments. And that question is, what's here that's not trying to have? What's here that's not trying to have? And more often than not, I use a particular version of that question adapted from Joanna Macy's work is, what's here that's not trying to predict, explain, or control? These have been my perpetual inquiries for a few months. And so I'd love for you to just sit with either one of those questions, even just for a moment. Say, what's here that's not trying to have? Or what's here that's not trying to predict, explain, or control?
I instantly went to control to try and memorize those 4 words. Predict, have, explain, and control. So that's what I did. But yeah, what's there? It's the open mind and
So what really came to mind was curiosity, and approaching anything, anyone, any experience, any moment with curiosity it can be a truly radical shift, because by definition you're not imposing, you're open, you're interested, you're willing to be surprised, and it's curiosity has a positive connotation. You know, it's not like standing in fear waiting for something bad to happen. It's actively opening your mind and yourself to whatever's going on around you. And I find that shifting into curiosity can be a really awakening tool.
Yeah. In fact, Peg often uses the line, curiosity is the universal solvent.
There you go. So I'm in the right place.
You're in good
but
company.
I am a wordy. And so my first thought was, how could you ask those two questions not in a negative form, but in a positive form, like without using the word not, so that we're not thinking about what we're not doing, we're thinking about what we are not doing or being. That's just a question that came to my mind. Is it possible to say those two things without using the word not?
It's possible. I think you'd have a different experience of it. So play with it and see what experience comes up.
I guess I'm all okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I've been stuck with the same thing from the beginning, that what I have is spirit. And I have a tender feeling about that I can return to that anytime I'm off base and not have any fixed ideas because things are always changing. But that's the part of me that I value as being the heart of me.
So what I've noticed for myself in practicing with this inquiry is that it's changed my experience of daily life quite a bit. So craving subsides a little bit. My ability to sort of savor things improves. And there's a little more space. In short, the quality of relating available outside of trying to possess a world of things is quite different. It's one marked by care. And so here are a couple of things that I've noticed open up. The first thing that I've noticed opening up is what I would call JOMO, or what someone might call the joy of missing out, rather than the familiar phrase that the kids use, the FOMO, the fear of missing out, meaning rather than experiencing the trapping overwhelm of the smorgasbord of choice, I can delight in experiencing what's right here, right now. It's always available. Even if that's not what I prefer. There's a joy in being with life directly. Second quality that I've noticed emerge is ease. So my particular trap is rumination. I can play over past things of past events that I'd like to redo and redo them dozens of times, or imagine future events and play them out in all the possible ways that they could go. And that shows up with a whole bunch of tension. But when I release those efforts, which are really just desires to own the past and the future, my body releases that tension, it softens, and my mind slows down a bit. So when I think about the past and future and preoccupation as a form of grasping and trying to own, and if I can let go of that, something shifts. And then the last one that I've noticed emerging is spontaneity. I've joked with Peg that every good idea I've had for work or my dissertation has come out of Zazen. Either not while I'm doing Zazen necessarily, but because I am. So it seems like better ideas or useful actions seem to crack me in the head a little bit more. And in relationship, I get to see a little more freely what's needed rather than what just this constructed I wants. And that seems to create some more space and room. Some teachings describe a host of experiences. The Jomo, ease, and spontaneity are just mine as lately, but I'll leave you with one last reminder from Gogu. This is the last quote we have, Nancy. So, outer path practitioners practice externally. Even if they think they're cultivating the mind or have had some powerful experience, they're objectifying everything as a thing they possess. Bodhidharma, or the Zen path, is the inner path. There's no attachment, no wisdom, no mind outside this moment. Because there's no attachment, we realize great wisdom that frees ourselves from fixations. We are at peace, and the joy from unloading our burden of afflictions is indescribable. So together, perhaps we can unload our shared burdens of possessing and find a little available joy. So I'd love to just end with that quote and see if anything shows up for you there. Does anything move in you as you consider Jogu's last word?
Hi. Yeah, I was just thinking that for me, um, the more fully present I am in whatever situation, the more, I mean, this is pretty basic, the more I'm released from any controlling and wanting to have and predict and all of those things. And the answer to the question, what was it, how much of you, is not, the controlling one? Not that much. But what that's but when the more fully present I am, the less of that there is. Thank you.
My thought is that a world in which things are owned is a world in which you could end up with nothing, with no food, with no shelter, with no medicine for your child. And I think that the idea of a world in which nothing is owned is just, I keep thinking about the Otomaya people in Ecuador, indigenous Ecuadorians, who have a lot of Latin American indigenous societies were communal, a vast majority of them, in fact, and they had concepts such as reciprocity, which were core. And for example, in this Ecuadorian tribe, if a couple shows up and has no land, then the person who has land has to give them land, because everybody needs to have land to farm to survive. There's no question about that. So in that community, you would never have to face the fear of being excluded and deprived and possibly, facing death or harm. And so I think every way I look at this, the less I conceive of things in terms of ownership, the more liberated I am.
What a lovely idea. Or a lovely edge to practice with, to be liberated from ownership. Feels like a nice place to stop. So, thank you very much.